The envelope a story of silence, service, and justice. The courtroom smelled like old wood and broken promises. Claire Carter sat in the third row, her army dress uniform pressed so sharply it could cut glass. 7 rows of service ribbons decorated her chest. A combat infantryman badge, an air assault insignia, 13 years of sacrifice pinned to her body like a quiet testimony. Her black beret sat perfectly level on her head, the blue flash of the 1st Armored Division catching the fluorescent courthouse light. She had survived Kandahar. She had survived Mosul. She had survived IED blasts that turned armored vehicles into crumpled tin. She had held dying soldiers in her arms in the dirt of foreign deserts and told them they were going to be okay even when she knew they weren't. But watching her mother tremble at that plaintiff's table, that was almost more than she could bear. Margaret Carter was 61 years old, and she looked every single year of it today. Her hands shook as she gripped the edge of the table. Her shoulders curved inward like a woman trying to make herself disappear. 34 years of marriage had done that to her. 34 years of being told she was nothing, worth nothing, capable of nothing without the man sitting 15 feet away from her with his expensive lawyer and his expensive suit and his expensive confidence. Richard Carter, Claire's father. She hadn't called him Dad in 4 years. Not since the night she'd come home from her second deployment and found her mother sitting alone in a dark kitchen with a bruise along her jaw that Richard explained away as a doorframe accident. Claire had looked at her mother's eyes that night, those tired, defeated eyes, and understood for the first time that some battles don't happen overseas. Richard sat at the defendant's table like a man who had already won. And why wouldn't he? He'd spent the last 18 months making sure of it. He had Gerald Whitmore, the most aggressive divorce attorney in Maricopa County, sitting beside him. He had hidden assets in 3 different LLCs. He had transferred the vacation home in Sedona to his brother's name 14 months ago. He had moved money offshore through a series of transactions that his accountant had been very careful to make look unremarkable. He had done everything right. Or so he believed. Claire reached into the breast pocket of her uniform jacket and touched the envelope. Still there. Cream-colored, sealed, unmarked on the outside. She had carried it for 6 weeks without opening it. She had carried it through 2 flights, a layover in Atlanta, and 3 sleepless nights in a comfort in 2 miles from this courthouse. She had carried it the way soldiers carry the most critical piece of intelligence on a mission, with absolute calm, absolute focus, and the complete understanding that the moment it was delivered, everything would change. The bailiff called the court to order. Judge Harold Brennan entered from the side door. He was a compact man in his early 60s, with silver hair and the kind of permanently neutral expression that came from decades of hearing the worst of human behavior without flinching. He had a reputation in Arizona family court for 2 things: absolute impartiality and 0 tolerance for courtroom theatrics. Claire was counting on both. The morning session was brutal to watch. Gerald Whitmore was a surgeon with language. He dismantled Margaret Carter's claims one by one, methodically, almost cheerfully. The marital home, mortgaged against Richard's business debts, he argued, essentially worthless as a liquid asset. The retirement accounts. Richard had documentation showing Margaret had agreed in writing to a specific division years ago. The savings, already allocated. The investments, complicated. The LLC properties. Not marital assets under Arizona law, he explained with practiced patience, because they were established as separate business entities. Margaret's attorney, a decent but overmatched woman named Patricia Lowe, objected where she could. The judge listened. The proceedings ground forward with the slow, merciless momentum of a machine built to process human misery efficiently. At one point, Richard turned in his chair and looked directly at Margaret. He said nothing. He didn't need to. His eyes said it for him. "You'll walk out with nothing." And Margaret trembled. Her pen moved across the document in front of her in a shaking line that barely resembled her signature. Claire watched her mother's hand and felt something cold and precise settle in her chest. Not anger. She had moved past anger 18 months ago when she'd first started making phone calls. What she felt now was the specific focus she recognized from combat operations. The clarity that arrives when the mission is real, the stakes are absolute, and there is no room left for doubt or hesitation. Patricia Lowe asked for a brief recess before final asset declarations were entered into the record. Judge Brennan granted 15 minutes. Claire stood up. She was 5'8" in boots, and the uniform added something beyond height. It added weight. It added history. 3 jurors in a civil trial across the hall had once told a court officer that they'd noticed the soldier sitting in the gallery. She had the stillness of someone who had seen serious things and decided to stay anyway. Claire walked forward through the low gate that separated the gallery from the well of the court. The bailiff moved toward her instinctively. "Specialist Carter?" Patricia Lowe looked confused. They had spoken twice by phone. She knew Claire was here. She did not know what Claire was carrying. "I need to address the court," Claire said quietly. "I have evidence that was not available when discovery closed." Whitmore was on his feet immediately. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The plaintiff's daughter has no standing to." "She has standing as a witness presenting documentary evidence," Patricia Lowe said, finding her footing suddenly. "I'd like to call her to the stand, Your Honor." Judge Brennan studied Claire for a long moment. His eyes moved over the uniform, the ribbons, the posture. He was not a man who was easily impressed by appearances, but he was a man who had spent 30 years watching people walk into his courtroom with secrets, and he had developed a very accurate instinct for when someone was carrying something real. "I'll allow it," he said. 5 minutes, counselor, make it count." Claire took the stand. She removed her beret and held it in her hands, not from regulation, but from respect. She had learned that gesture from a colonel she'd served under in Germany, a man who said that removing your cover indoors in a civilian space was a way of saying I am here as a person, not just a rank. It was the kind of small truth that stayed with you. Patricia Lowe approached. "Please state your name for the record." "Claire Elaine Carter, Sergeant First Class. United States Army, currently assigned to the 1st Armored Division at Fort Bliss." "And your relationship to the petitioner?" "Margaret Carter is my mother." "You've indicated you have documentary evidence relevant to these proceedings. Can you describe how this evidence came into your possession?" Claire reached into her jacket and withdrew the envelope. The courtroom was very quiet. 14 months ago, she said, I was on leave following my 3rd deployment. I visited my parents' home in Scottsdale. While I was there, I had a conversation with my father's former business partner, a man named Dennis Holt. Dennis and my father had a falling out in 2021 over financial decisions Dennis believed were fraudulent. She paused. Dennis contacted me privately in January of this year. He had been sitting on certain documents because he was afraid. He gave them to me because he believed, his words, that I was the only person in the family who wouldn't be intimidated into losing them. Whitmore was objecting. The judge silenced him with one raised hand and a look that communicated something final. Claire continued. The envelope contains certified copies of internal financial transfer records, correspondence between my father and an offshore account management firm in the Cayman Islands, and a sworn affidavit from Dennis Holt detailing the deliberate movement of approximately $2.3 million in marital assets out of traceable accounts beginning in March of 2022, 14 months before divorce proceedings were initiated. The silence in the room changed quality. It became the kind of silence that has weight. Your Honor, Claire said, turning to face Judge Brennan directly, I respectfully request that the court review this evidence before any final asset declarations are entered into the record. She placed the envelope on the edge of the witness stand. Patricia Lowe carried it to the bench. What happened next, Claire would think about for years. Judge Brennan opened the envelope with the small silver letter opener he kept on the bench for exhibits. He removed the documents. There were 11 pages, plus the affidavit. He began to read. His expression did not change for the first 2 pages. Claire watched his eyes move. She watched him reach the 3rd page, which contained the transfer records. She watched him reach page 7, which was the correspondence with the offshore firm, in which Richard Carter had written, in his own hand in a personal email, that he needed to make sure the old bird doesn't see a dime of the real money. The judge's mouth twitched. Then Judge Harold Brennan, 30-year veteran of the Arizona family court bench, leaned back in his chair and did something that no one in the courtroom had ever seen him do before. He laughed. It was a short sound, almost involuntary, like a man who had been told a joke he hadn't expected to land. He pressed 2 fingers to his lips immediately, reasserting his composure. But then he leaned slightly toward the bench's edge, closer to the envelope, and in a voice that was barely above a murmur but carried perfectly in the shocked silence of the room, he said, "Oh, this is brilliant." Claire looked at her father. Richard Carter had gone the color of old plaster. His jaw was set, but his eyes had changed. The confidence was gone, not slowly, not in stages, but all at once, like a light switched off. Whitmore had leaned in and was speaking quickly into his ear, but Richard wasn't listening. He was staring at that envelope on the judge's bench the way a man stares at the door of a room he knows he should never have entered. Claire watched him carefully. She felt no satisfaction in his fear. She had not done this for satisfaction. She had done it because her mother had given 34 years of her life to that man and deserved to walk out of this building with what was rightfully hers. She had done it because Dennis Holt had been afraid and she had not been, and sometimes that was the only qualification courage required. She had done it because she was her mother's daughter, and her mother had raised her to understand that standing up was not optional. Judge Brennan called a full recess and summoned both attorneys to chambers. The recess lasted 40 minutes. Claire sat beside her mother in the gallery. Margaret Carter did not speak. She held her daughter's hand in both of hers and pressed it against her chest, and Claire could feel her mother's heartbeat, fast at first, then gradually, over the course of those 40 minutes, slowing toward something that might have been, for the first time in years, peace. When court reconvened, Gerald Whitmore looked like a man who had aged a decade in a single afternoon. He requested a continuance. Judge Brennan denied it. He suggested his client might wish to consider a revised settlement offer in light of the new evidence and the likelihood of further forensic accounting. Whitmore spoke quietly to Richard for 3 full minutes. Richard Carter, who had built a career on intimidation and control, who had yelled across a courtroom that his wife would walk out with nothing, who had spent 18 months engineering what he believed was a perfect financial disappearance act. Richard Carter nodded. The revised offer was submitted 40 minutes later. The vacation home in Sedona, the primary residence, 60% of the retirement accounts, a structured settlement representing a negotiated fraction of the offshore funds, which Richard apparently preferred to the alternative of a full forensic audit, and the criminal fraud referral that Judge Brennan had mentioned, quite calmly, as a possible outcome if the matter proceeded to further litigation. Patricia Lowe brought the documents to Margaret. Margaret looked at her daughter. Claire nodded once. Margaret signed. Her hand did not shake this time. They walked out of the courthouse at 4:47 in the afternoon into the flat gold light of an Arizona spring. Claire carried her beret in her hand. Margaret walked beside her, and for the first time in as long as Claire could remember, her mother walked with her shoulders back. They didn't speak for half a block. Then Margaret said, "The envelope, how long did you have it?" 6 weeks. Were you nervous? Claire considered the question honestly. On the flight, she said, not after. Margaret was quiet again. Then, your father is going to be very angry. Yes. He's going to say things. He can say whatever he wants, Claire said. He's going to say it from a position of considerably less financial leverage than he had this morning. Margaret made a sound that took Claire a moment to identify. It had been so long since she'd heard it. Her mother was laughing, a real laugh, unguarded and sudden, the kind that surprised the person doing it. Claire put her arm around her mother's shoulders. They stood at the corner of Jefferson and 4th Avenue, in the lengthening afternoon shadow of the courthouse. And Claire Carter, who had served 3 combat deployments, who had carried wounded soldiers, who had been awarded a Bronze Star for actions in a valley in eastern Afghanistan, whose name most Americans could not pronounce. held her mother, and understood something she had known intellectually for years, but now knew in her bones. The bravest thing she had ever done had nothing to do with a rifle. It was carrying an envelope into a room, standing up, and refusing to let the wrong person win. 3 weeks later, Dennis Holt received a handwritten note on plain paper. 2 sentences. He didn't win. Thank you for trusting me with the truth. It was signed simply, Carter. He kept it on his refrigerator for the rest of his life.